Contacting the Dead, Lesson 1. Sleep is an altered state of consciousness. To fall asleep is to fall into a deep healing trance. In the spectrum of realities, being awake is on one side and being asleep is way, way on the other. To be absorbed in a movie, a game, or work is to enter a light trance. Daydreams, prayers, or obsessing are heavier trances. Most people enter trances reflexively. To contact the spirit world, you must control the way you enter this state of being that is somewhere between waking and sleeping.
Ho-ri-o-ho, ho-ri-o-ho, ho-ri-o-ho-ho. Hello, and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And this time around, we are reading Eden Robinson's novel, Monkey Beach.
Which I loved.
And this is the first time that either of us have read it.
That might be the first time that both of us have been new to a book.
This book was recommended specifically by my husband, Mikey, but by a lot of people, really, who I've heard rave about this book over the years and say that it's very exciting and very interesting and very good. And I agree.
Mm-hmm.
Before we start talking about the book in more detail, however, I guess there's a few things we should note. First off is that there is going to be a spoiler alert at some point in a little bit. We'll talk about it for a while without spoilers first, but we will let you know so that if you don't want to be spoiled on the novel, you know when to stop listening, when to come back to it. Secondly, we've just heard some exciting news about the novel, which is that it's been turned into a film.
Yeah, it's so serendipitous.
It's going to be premiered at the Vancouver International Film Festival soon, real soon, like in a week.
Next week.
or possibly this week, depending on when this episode goes out. But yeah, it'll be real soon. So I'm excited to see that.
Especially because it deals with time in interesting ways, which aren't always very easy to translate into film.
Yeah, and a lot of it is very sort of internal and seen from perspectives, right? Lisa, the main character, who's also our narrator and our guide through this community and these worlds, sees things in specific ways that not everybody agrees with or not everybody has access to. So how do you get that across in a movie? Well, it certainly can be done, but it seems like an interesting challenge. And another little tidbit, not related to the book this time, but something we talked about a while ago, a year ago or so.
And great news.
Yeah, this is fantastic news. We talked about, you might remember, the autobiography of Malcolm X. And in that episode, we complained that there was no proper audiobook for it, which seemed awful.
Terrible.
Absolutely. Well, that has changed. I now have in my audiobook collection an audiobook of the autobiography of Malcolm X. Haven't had a chance to listen to it yet because I just picked it up last night, but it exists. And I believe it's read by Lawrence Fishburne.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that.
Yay. So I'm glad that gap in the audiobook world has been filled in. That is good. I believe that's only available on Audible, but there you go. That's at least it exists. At least it exists. All right. Now that's, I think, all the business out of the way, and we can get into Monkey Beach proper. So Monkey Beach is a relatively recent book for us, at least compared to Purgatorio. What do you know about Eden Robinson, the author?
Well, Eden Robinson is a First Nations author who's a member of the Haisla and Heiltsuk First Nations. She was born out in Kitimat, British Columbia, and she's written a number of novels, including Monkey Beach, which is her first novel, and plus a few others, including Blood Sports and a series of novels, Son of a Trickster, Trickster Drift, and then a third one in that series that's still forthcoming. And she's also written a nonfiction book called Sasquatch at Home, Traditional Protocols and Modern Storytelling. So she's a very active figure, and in that way really kind of a departure from some of the usual reading we do, where a lot of times we're pulling out canonical books that a lot of people have read or have stuck around for a long time, like if we've done the Aeneid or Dante or whatever. But this fits in really interestingly well with our cluster of books on education and really led me to see a lot of things in different ways. So I feel like it's going to be a really good choice for us.
Well, and it's a book that received a lot of acclaim when it first came out, in the form of being nominated for some major awards. And then also it's still clearly vital enough that they're making a movie out of it now. So it's definitely had a bit of sticking power. And I've heard plenty of my Canadian English PhD student friends rave about it, say great things about it. So let's give a quick plot summary, a bit of it that isn't spoiler, stuff that you'll figure out within the first few pages, and then we'll alert these spoilers.
To whet your appetite.
To help you decide if you want to read it before listening to the rest of this podcast. Of course, it won't be the end of the world if you know about it before you start reading it, but, it is fun to read the book without knowing where it's going.
And that's always true. But I feel like with this book in particular, I felt like a lot of the pleasure in it came with the sense of discovery, which was sometimes very painful, but at other moments was, I don't know, transcendent is a kind of a fancy word for it. But I felt like the sense of discovery was a big part of what makes this book really powerful.
Yeah, I agree. So, Monkey Beach is told from the point of view of Lisa, who's a young woman, about 19 years old, in Kitimat, which is on the coast of British Columbia, and it's a major community for the Haisla Nation. Her younger brother, Jimmy, was a former swimming ace who had a chance at the Olympics, but he's just started a job on a seiner, which is, say, a fishing boat, and that boat has gone missing. Her parents rush down to be closer to the rescue mission, and soon Lisa's going to take her own small boat and work her way down to join them. And while all this is happening, she thinks about her life story so far and how things ended up where they've ended up. And so the story introduces us to many different people of different generations, some living, some dead. And I think this is one of the most striking things about the book, how efficiently it depicts people who, despite having a similar background and similar traditions, and despite going through shared histories of oppression and colonization, nevertheless have a really wide variety of perspectives within and towards those cultures and histories. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, and like different ways of dealing with that and different ways of responding. I mean, there's a tremendous spectrum here of experience.
Yeah. We also learn early on that there's a strange visitor who sometimes she sees, a red-haired man who never speaks, who's very small, and who no one else can see, which is very curious. And I think before we send off people who don't want to be spoiled any further away, is there anything else that you want to add to entice them to read it?
Yeah, like maybe a kind of a broad thing. A lot of times we talk about genre in the books that we read. And if we wanted to talk about genre in connection with this book, it would be easy to say it's kind of like gothic. It's a bit scary. You could associate it with books that have magic realism, which is where you have sort of imaginative, fantastical things that seem to happen almost side by side with the things in the regular world. So you'll be reading a passage, we have this description of the regular world, and then something incredibly bizarre, and then it just keeps going and something regular happens. So writers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez and so on are often seen as part of this magic realist tradition. And you could see this book in that light, but that would be misleading, I think, in some really important way, because here, those elements that we might otherwise call magic realist are windows or gaps, or almost like shimmering glimpses into this other world, this spirit world, which is also real, which is fully real. And so just in that sort of broad sense, that's the flavor of this book, or one of the flavors in this book.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. You could also read it as a kind of coming of age story. And I guess we're going to be focusing on a lot of that when we talk about education.
Yeah.
And it's also a kind of portrait of a community, right?
Mm-hmm. And a family.
Yeah. So yeah, in some ways, a bit like Middlemarch in that sense of you're seeing a variety of different people in different positions throughout a community and how they interact with each other.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
So a lot to recommend it. Very readable book, not very, 300, 400 pages. So go for it. Go for it if you're going to read it. Do it.
Yeah. And also just saying about the reading, it usually takes me a little while to get through a book. And this book, it took me a little while to get through the first 30 or 40 pages, but then I read the rest of it in a single sitting. I was really into it.
Wow.
So I recommend it highly.
And just before we go on, a little content warning that there will be a lot of things that might be triggering for some people or that you may not want to hear about right now, including graphic violence, death, sexual assault. There's more. I don't know. I can't think of everything. But if things in that sort of area are not what you want to hear right now, then save this episode for when you're up for it. All right. Here on out, there are spoilers. So
this is a hard book.
So this is a hard book.
Oh.
We probably should have said that before the spoiler bit. It's a very sad book. It's a very...
It's easy in the sense that it's so readable and you just so pulled in and so absorbed in it. And it's hard in that I was weeping when I was reading large parts of this book.
Oh, it's brutal. It's just a brutal tale of
people who are suffering, people who hurt each other, people who damage each other.
People who get damaged by things that are not really supposed to be damaging them.
Mm-hmm. Animals.
Yeah.
A lot of things.
A lot of things. It's very bleak and very nonstop.
But it's also extremely beautiful.
Yeah. Oh, and there's moments of humor and delight and so forth. Like it's not one note.
No.
But it is a lot. And I think we'll talk about that aspect of it a bit more later.
Yeah.
But to talk more about what goes on in the novel, it's a little tricky because there's actually rather a lot of plot, I realized as I was trying to summarize it. It's divided into 4 parts.
Of very different sizes.
Of very different sizes. The first 2 are quite lengthy. The third one is much shorter, and the fourth one is very, very short, but very intense. The first chapter focuses on her early childhood, and especially on Lisa's relationship with her uncle Mick, who has been absent from the family for a while, believed to be in jail, but actually just trying to keep things on the down low. He's kind of the activist of the family, willing to put everything on the line for what he thinks is right. And Lisa, it turns out, is kind of the same way, or at least she acts a lot without thinking about the consequences or worrying about the consequences.
He calls her his little warrior.
Yes, yeah.
And monster.
And monster. And so they have a lot to bond over, and it becomes a very meaningful relationship, which sadly comes to an end at the end of the chapter as he dies, quite suddenly and unexpectedly and horribly, being drowned and attacked by seals before her eyes. So that's gruesome. The second part focuses on Lisa entering puberty, basically, and on her relationship with her grandmother, Mama'u, and, all the usual going into your teenage years kind of stuff about boys and whatnot.
And her relationship with her grandmother, her mamau, in some ways kind of inhabits the space that her relationship with her uncle filled, in the sense that she continues to, grow as a person or the human being with her grandmother in ways that are a little bit like what happened with her uncle.
And also that her grandmother appreciates her in ways that other family members and other people she interacts with don't. She says at one point that one of the things that she appreciates about her grandmother is that she's able to sass her, basically, and she just is fine with it. She'll throw it right back at her or whatever. But to my mind, her grandmother treats her like a human being. So that's a really meaningful relationship to her, and was, similar in that way to how Mick had treated her. There's a lot more that we could talk about the second part, and maybe we will. It ends with Mama'u dying in a terrible way as well. She is cooking one day and accidentally some grease catches fire, and her entire house and her burn up along with it. And once again, Lisa gets to be a witness to not the burning, but her body being taken out. And she gets to see what the burnt body looks like, which again, very gruesome.
Yeah, and those passages really parallel one another in all kinds of ways, especially because she feels guilt in both cases. With the death of her uncle, she's like, she almost went along with him to go check the fish nets. And so even though obviously we know, and she probably knows, she couldn't have saved him, she wasn't there. And the same thing with Mamau's death. She could have been there, but instead she ended up choosing to go somewhere else. And so she blames herself really explicitly for that death.
Yeah, and we might get into that a bit more as well in a bit. The third part of the book is her later teenage years. Mama'u left her a trust fund, a very handsome trust fund, and she's sort of dropped out of school and is drinking a lot, but she manages to come back to town to go to the funeral of one of her childhood friends. And at this point, she re-encounters her family after not having been with them for a little while, and her younger brother has hurt himself, and so his Olympic dreams are dashed. And he's finally started dating a girl that he's had a crush on for years, whose nickname is Karaoke. And at the very end of this chapter, Lisa finds out, and Jimmy, the brother, finds out that Karaoke's uncle has been having some sort of sexual relationship with her, and that in fact she's even had an abortion of one of his children.
There's a lot to say about that.
Yep, there's a lot to say about that. And then in the final part of the book, she's arrived at Monkey Beach on her route to go catch up with her parents in the present time. And how would you describe what goes on in the final chapter?
Well, in a way, the final chapter is almost a microcosm of the whole book, because we start the book off with her kind of, having heard the news that her brother's boat is lost, being in this kind of suspended state of waiting and apprehensiveness and wanting to find him and know what's happened to him. And then we kind of periodically return to that time reference throughout the book. And then when we get to the end, at each point we've been sort of checking in as she's, left the house, begun to make the journey by motorboat down the coast to get to where her parents are to look for her brother. And she ends up not going all the way to the place where the boat was last seen, to where her parents are, but rather to Monkey Beach, which is like a point of reference throughout the novel. It's a place they visited as children. It's a place where there was a Haisla community a long time ago. There's many, many, many layers of history at Monkey Beach. And so the last part of the book takes place on Monkey Beach. And it takes place in this time, but it also takes place in other times.
Monkey Beach is also the place where, when she was a child, she saw a bigwas. I think that's how it's pronounced. She saw a Sasquatch. And this was a thing that she had been told when she was even younger was a mythical thing, except her grandmother seemed to believe that they were real. And sure enough, she manages to see one. It's, one of a number of things that she is able to see that most people around her can't encounter. Something we might call supernatural.
Yeah, I mean, you put your finger on something we would call supernatural. It comes back to that point I was trying to make earlier about magic realism. Like, it's not that there's like this fantastical imaginative stuff that happens, these fantasies or whatever. It's that there's more than one world here. And sometimes you can see something from that other world. And Lisa, her eyes are particularly open to it. She has this capacity to see things. And so whether it's the Sasquatch or whether it's other things or hearing voices or having some kind of point of contact with this other world, the little man, that's a place where the veil is especially thin between these worlds.
I found there was a really interesting tension in the book between representing these things as supernatural, as strange, as something a little bit off, and also as something that is completely real, completely natural, completely part of the world. And I don't have a good passage to sort of point to that. I can definitely point to passages.
I have one from really early. I mean, tell me if this is the flavor you're talking about. It's when she sees the bigwis, the Sasquatch. She's gone chasing after her brother, who's desperate to take a photograph of one of these Sasquatches so that he can, make a lot of money by selling it to a newspaper or something like that. And she goes running after him. And so she occasionally catches glimpses of a brown shirt and she hears Jimmy up ahead, right? But she can't catch up to him. And then this happens. I could feel someone watching me. Jimmy? The sweat on my body was stinging cuts and scratches I hadn't been aware of before, was drying fast, making my skin cold. I turned very slowly. No one was behind me. I turned back and saw him. Just for a moment, just a glimpse of a tall man covered in brown fur. He gave me a wide, friendly smile, but he had too many teeth and they were all pointed. He backed into the shadows, then stepped behind a cedar tree and vanished. I couldn't move. Then I heard myself screaming and I stood there, not moving. Jimmy came running. Jimmy was wearing a gray sweatshirt. I stared at him and he stared out at the bushes. So there's a lot going on there, right? Like, it's this apparition, right? But it's a tall man, right? Covered in brown fur. So it's a man, but it's not, it's like in between, and he smiles, but he had too many teeth, And when we hear that Jimmy's wearing a gray sweatshirt, we're like, oh, Jimmy was not wearing a brown shirt, right?
Yeah.
So she'd seen him all along.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that for me, that was one of those moments where you're like, what is real here? Right? We're sort of in between these worlds.
There is an interesting moment even earlier on, perhaps very early on, page 3 of the book, where she wakes up at the very beginning. And the first thing, actually, the first line of the book is 6 crows sit in our green gage tree, half awake. I hear them speak to me in Haisla.
Mm-hmm.
La es, they say, la es, la es. And then 2 pages later, she mentions this to her mother. Did you hear the crows earlier? I say. And when her father doesn't answer, I find myself babbling. They were talking to me. They said la es. It's probably clearly a sign, Lisa, my mother has come up behind me and grips my shoulder, that you need Prozac.
Mm.
So there's a nice switcheroo there, right? It's clearly a sign, which of course it is, that you need Prozac. Ah, she's turning it into a joke. And this becomes even more interesting when later on we find out from Mamau that her mother had this vision, had this ability to see these things, but she's turned her back on it. So we're introduced to the possibility that the crows could be speaking to her, the mother seeming to agree with this, and then immediately slapping it down. And then it just gets more complicated as it goes on as to what the truth status and what the reality status of these things are.
Yeah. And one of the things that's so fascinating in this book, one of the many things, is that this question of truth and reality plays out on this kind of like we were calling it supernatural realm. That's not really the right word, but like the spirit world and the regular world, right? So what's there and not there, the layers of reality that are always there, that's one level that it plays out on. But the other level it plays out on is all the stuff that people know and don't talk about, or things that people talk about in one way, but it turns out that the real story is different. So when we start thinking about the educational process of this novel and the many layers on which that plays out, one of them has to do with kind of learning the stories of your own family and the things that people didn't talk about, or the things that people cloaked in more comfortable truths. So what's true and what's real is a big issue in the everyday world as much as it is in the sort of question of the spirit world.
Yeah. Was there a moment where that notably popped out for you?
Well, one really important place that pops out is the whole question of whatever happened to Lisa's grandfather, Babau,
Yes.
who's already passed away before the novel ever starts. And so Lisa has never known him. And the story is in the family that he'd gone in to take a shower and somehow had fallen down, hit his head, and nobody discovered him until too late. He'd, I guess, drowned in the shower or died, right? And then at some point in the novel, we hear from a relative who's intoxicated that maybe something happened. Maybe, maybe people let him die or look the other way. And then later on, right near the end of the book, as part of Lisa's sort of visionary experience, she sees Mamau and she sees that scene and she sees Mamau, sitting at the table all bruised and the water's coming out from under the door and she's not doing anything. Right. So what's true and what's not true and what are the hidden truths is something that keeps playing out through this book over and over and over again. And there's many other examples.
Yeah, that's true. And that is a very striking example also because one of the threads of the book is Lisa having to figure out exactly what her grandfather was like and what that says about everyone else in her family. And her grandfather seems to have been incredibly abusive to everyone.
Yeah. And yet she has ways into, I guess you would say, a relationship with him, even though he died before she was ever born, because there's a remarkable scene where Mamau takes Lisa with her on the birthday of her grandfather to light a fire and to speak to him, to visit with him. Do you remember that scene?
Oh, yes.
So on Babau's birthday, Mamau took me down to the octopus beds, she said. She brought a bottle of Johnny Walker and a pack of Players cigarettes. She made me carry the box of Twinkies with a stern warning that she knew exactly how many were left. So they get wood, make a fire, and Mamau says, "Sherman," she says, "happy birthday, you crazy old bugger. I brought you some things." And then she says some words in Haisla that I didn't understand, Lisa says, and passed the bottle over the fire. "This is for Sherman," she said, placing it carefully near the center of the flames. "You better appreciate that. Say hi to your babao, Lisa." "But he's not here," I said. "Yes, he is," she said. "You just can't see him because he's dead." And then it goes on, and they feed the Twinkies into the fire and the Johnny Walker into the fire. And Lisa does have a conversation, right? The grandmother says, "Say his name. If you don't say his name, another ghost will snatch it up." "Hello, babao. I can count to 10 in Haisla. Want to hear?" And the grandmother says, "Go ahead. He's listening." Then she counts. They feed the Twinkies. And it goes on. I mean, the scene's kind of funny and sweet and playful, but it's also like they're talking to the dead and with a real sense of presence. And then there's another moment that happens later on where Lisa's hanging out at Mamau's house and she's baking a cake, and she bakes this enormous cake, right? That is usually just baked for sort of family gatherings. It's a big giant cake. And they're chatting, and the grandmother says, "The next time I bake with this, you'll be getting married." "Yeah, to who?" I said. "Someone rich." Then she said it was time to go, and she wanted to show me something. She brought the cake out to the car, and I thought we were going to a funeral, but we went to the docks instead. We climbed into her boat, and then they go, and they get to the old graveyard. And then she goes and points out the different graves in the graveyard, and they build a small fire, and she feeds the cake to it, right? So this idea that you can visit with and talk to and feed the people in the spirit world, like there's a point of communication, and the point of communication is through fire, and maybe in a way through water too, but through fire. It's weird because when I was reading this, I was like fascinated by it. And I was like, "Oh, this is so interesting. This is so strange. This is so different." And then I was like, "Oh no, the Iliad," right? Because there too, that's the way you communicate there with the gods. But there's like this vehicle, there's this other world, there's this world, and there's this other world. And there's a door. There are doors between them. And one of them is through fire. And so I was really struck by that. I was like, wow, it feels so different and strange. And it also feels, of course, it's like that. I'm not describing it very well, but it was a really strange sense of like defamiliarity and familiarity at the same time reading about that.
So there's a few thoughts that I have about that. I guess one of them is that it's interesting that we have these moments of Mama'u sort of tenderly speaking and offering things to Baba'u. I mean, not tenderly as in, lovey-dovely, but like they have a kind of relationship, you old devil or whatever she says there. And you can see that as a couple who have been married for decades interacting with one another. But you don't get a sense from that, the thing that you learn later on, which is that he was so awful to her.
Yeah. No, he beat her. And the situation in the household was so bad that she sent 2 of her children, her second and third children, not the eldest and not the youngest, away to residential school. And we're going to want to talk about the implications of that for those people and also for the whole family and the community. But I think what's going on there is that we want to say, oh, he's a bad man, he's culpable. But this is an environment where, how can I put it? There's a way of managing people who have done bad things, who have done wrong things, but they're still not cast out from the community. So, for example, in the very last part of the book, when Lisa is in the spirit world, she's going to see her uncle with his father, and they're going to be companionable together, even though their relationship in life was, there was a lot. Right.
Yeah, and that's still carrying on even as they're dead, right? There's still this sense of, oh, you're so like that. Oh, you're so frustrating. Oh, these are these things that I am still mad at you about.
But they're not cast apart from each other.
Right. They're still staying in community with one another. They're finding ways to do this as much as possible. And that was something that I found striking throughout the book, was this need for the community to persevere, even with the people who are terrible elements within it.
Yeah, that people go through terrible things, some very terrible things, and some don't survive and some do. And some are deformed by the hardship they go through, and some more and some less, right? But they all continue to be part of the fabric of the community. They never stop being part of that. So this is part of what we're seeing, is how do you navigate that? How do you negotiate that? How do you manage? How do you deal with terrible transgressions and violence within your own community? Because what they're dealing with is the effects of settler colonialism, not just in the direct negative impacts it's had on the people who are under its yoke, right? But by the way, it actually puts so much pressure on that it has people inside the communities and the families turning on one another. You know what I mean? Like, the damage isn't just the direct damage. The damage is to actually turn people against one another, cause people to cause violence to one another from inside, which is the most terrible thing of all.
Yeah. The other thing that struck me about those scenes with Mama'u offering gifts to Baba'u on the fire with Lisa there was that it was her showing Lisa and teaching Lisa about these, these traditions, these acts, these ways of communicating with dead relatives, that it is something that Lisa is not getting anywhere else.
No, that's what I meant about her life with her grandmother being sort of a continuation of the education she'd been having with her uncle. Like, it's not a school or a classroom. It's this educational environment, this whole other educational environment that's different from the schools.
Yeah, although Mick wasn't going to be teaching her about this sort of thing, right?
No.
Mick was teaching her about how to be in the world, how to think politically, how to think about, resisting colonialism, resisting the forces that try to force you into a particular shape or a particular way of being that may not be what you want or need. This is teaching you actually some of the same stuff, but in a very different way.
He does teach her a song.
That's true. She teaches a number of songs, one of which she sings at school, which we'll talk about in just a second, I think. Actually, yeah, let's talk about that, because part of the cultural situation that they're in under colonialism is a specific attempt by the state, by the Canadian state, to remove their culture, to destroy it, to take away these kinds of lessons, which was done under a number of ways, and most notably the residential schools that 2 of Mama'u's children ended up at. For those who are not from Canada and who don't know what residential schools are, do you want to give the very quick summary of them?
Yeah, and there's a lot to say about it, but I'm going to say very little. So this is a structure that was imposed on Indigenous people from the 19th century on through the 20th century. The last residential school didn't close until 1996. The purpose of these residential schools was sometimes formulated as to take the Indian out of the child. The idea being that you could educate these children to making them fully belong to white culture in Canada. And that would all be bad enough, right? Because it entailed not letting the children speak their own languages and taking them away from their families and taking them away from the communities and the lands that they belong to, right? But they were also absolutely horrible sites where there was terrible malnourishment, even purposeful malnourishment, like experimental malnourishment of children in these places, and tons of records of beatings and sexual abuse, really horrible stuff going on in these places. And they were all over Canada. And it was only in the latter part of the 20th century that this started coming to light in a meaningful kind of way. And it took a long time for the schools to be closed down, and even longer time for something like a full accounting of what went on there. And so now you can find things like lists of all the children who died in the residential schools and accounts of their names and their pictures and so on. And the particular residential school that's in the background here in Monkey Beach is a school called the Alberni Residential School. It's mentioned at one point in the novel, again, in a very in passing kind of way. We never get descriptions of the insides of the residential schools or any of that. We don't get any background about that in this novel, but we get the name. And that's enough to kind of give you the sense that there's a whole huge backstory of abuse on what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission called sexual terrorism. So we know that two of the characters here, Lisa's Uncle Mick and her Aunt Trudy, both were in that school. And in some ways, we hear about it in ways that are sort of superficially positive. Like we hear that Uncle Mick was on a basketball team together with his friend Josh, and how they were great, and and Uncle Mick was like the most valuable player and stuff. And then if you look it up, you could see that the Alberni basketball team was hugely successful, in that period, right? So that kind of, but it was also a place where terrible sexual abuse was going on that only came out later on, and physical abuse and deaths.
So we'll have some links for you to find out more information about that in the show notes. But that is something that is very much hovering in the background. It's this attempt.
It's this big black hole of trauma.
Yeah.
Behind the book.
And trauma done, let's say, in the name of education, or nominally in the name of education, right?
Well, these are schools.
They are schools. They're attempting to teach/indoctrinate children into being part of Canada. And it would be much too glib to say, oh, well, that residential school was shut down. Everything's fine now. The first scene that we get inside of a school is when Lisa is quite young and she's being asked by her teacher to read a passage from one of her books. And so the teacher had forced us, she says, to read a book that said that the Indians on the northwest coast of British Columbia, her people in other words, had killed and eaten people as religious sacrifices. My teacher had made each of us read a paragraph out loud. When my turn came, I sat there shaking, absolutely furious. Lisa, she'd said, do you hear me? Please read the next paragraph. But it's all lies, I'd said. The teacher stared at me as if I were mutating into a hideous thing from outer space. And, this goes on until finally she starts singing a song that Uncle Mick had taught her called Fuck the Oppressors. And, well, that gets a certain reaction out of the class and a strongly worded note home to her parents.
The class cheers, but she goes to the principal's office. But the best thing is Uncle Mick's reaction.
Oh, he's so happy. It says, Mick went out and had the teacher's note laminated and framed, which is the only right thing to do in that situation.
He put the note in the center of his living room.
It's so good.
But awful, right? But awful. She shouldn't have had to do that.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't perhaps at the same level as the residential schools, of course. I don't want to overstate things, but this is still.
But the problem is not gone.
No, it's still absolutely awful, and it's still, white supremacy in the classroom, and it's still children being traumatized by being forced through the system. So we can compare that with the other forms of education that she gets from Uncle Mick and Mama'u, which seem much more healthy, let's say.
Yeah.
Even though they are not generally approved of by a lot of the community, right?
Well, it's weird. Like, Mama'u kind of teaches her all this traditional knowledge, right? This traditional learning, but it's kind of, I don't want to say secret, it's just unobtrusive, like, so Lisa's with her grandmother and, and they go out and they like, gather some food in the, out in the wilderness. But she's also teaching her all kinds of things that are precious to know, different kinds of ceremony, different kinds of ways of interacting with the natural world. And that includes bits and pieces of her language, which Lisa only knows some terms of. She doesn't know how to speak it fully. She, at one point, hopes that, if she learns a word a day from her grandmother, how long will it take her to learn the language, right? And she gets discouraged because that means it will take a really, really long time. But just, she's in this entering in stage into a kind of a knowledge for people and their history and their way of being in the world.
Yeah. And as you say, one that's never going to be sufficient for how much she ought to be able to get out of it, let's say.
Yeah. One of the things that's so striking is that first we're set up with this almost kind of dichotomy between school and time with Mama, right? There's this moment where Lisa's like, oh, I wish summer would never end. I wished I could do this all year and never have to go back to school. I wished I could pick berries and go fishing with Mama and spend all my days wandering. And that at first makes you think like, work, play, school, hanging out with Mama, right? But being with Mama is an education. And you get all these really kind of almost didactic passages where we learn terms for different things in the natural world, which berries are sweet, which ones have a different kind of flavor, how to prepare them, how to make what they call grease out of these small fish called ulichans. I found those passages absolutely absorbing. I loved them.
There was a lot that was going on in those passages, I found. And I found that very interesting because, of course, on the one hand, it is casually relaying important cultural information, just the way Mamau is kind of casually relaying, but very pointedly, casually relaying this information to Lisa, right? So that is happening again for the reader or the reader who doesn't know this stuff, or even the reader who does, right? Like it's a way of continuing this conversation, of repeating it, of making it more there.
Yeah, and these passages, I feel like, mark a kind of a transition from Lisa's time with her uncle to Lisa's time with her grandmother. Because it's not like Uncle Mick dies and she starts to spend time with the grandmother. Like, Uncle Mick likes to bring things to the grandmother, right? So that's partly how Lisa enters into that spending time together. So, for example, there's this one passage that illustrates this. Mick liked to bring her things. When the salmon berries came out, we picked 2 buckets. I like to pick out the red ones because the sweetness depends on the color of the berry, with red being the sweetest, orange less sweet, and yellow the mildest. Ripe berries can be as long as the tip of your thumb and are best picked before they become mushy. People who haven't grown up with salmon berries call the taste watery and seedy. I think of the taste as a soft sweetness, a gentle flavor. And that passage goes on describing the physical characteristics of these different berries. It's extremely beautiful, I think really lyrical. And there's the description of how you make what she calls salmon berry stew out of the berries. When we had them ready, we'd bring them to Mama and she'd soak them in a large pot with cold water and a bit of salt to chase the bugs out. She'd open her jars of blueberries and huckleberries, then leave them on the table. We'd sit in her living room while the fresh berries were soaking and watch The Young and the Restless, All My Children, or in the evening, Dynasty, which Mama loves more than almost anything. And then later on, Mama would bring out the berries, add a few tablespoons of ulichan grease, and then this description of her making these foods. So like you were saying, it's didactic. We are either learning or being reminded of this cultural knowledge. And there's many passages like this that kind of almost in a way bring the reader into this world to some extent. And this is knowledge that Lisa has to be taught, right? You don't just, born knowing this stuff, right? You have to acquire it from the people around you.
So the other thing that I found really interesting about some of these passages was thinking about how they work in terms of the reader, and both readers from within the culture and readers from outside of the culture, such as myself. So she very often will introduce the Haisla words and then very quietly define them. A few times I actually didn't realize she had defined them, and then I went back and realized from how they were introduced and then from the context that they were being spoken in, oh, that's what that means. That right there is the definition, which I didn't realize was a definition at the time.
She does it beautifully.
It's very calm and very subtle. And part of that makes me think, oh, this is explaining it for, a non-Haisla, for a white audience, let's say. This is a mainstream Canadian audience. This is a tactic to get it out there. And then I thought, well, no, yes, I guess it is doing that, but there's more to it than that. It is also a point of contact for people perhaps within the community to see their words there. But even more so, it's Lisa who only has so many of these words, right? And she's only has them so much. She didn't get nearly as much time to learn these words as she might have wanted to. And so she, in a sense, I could imagine her trying to hold on to them.
They're precious.
They're very precious. And she's constantly reminding herself of the words and of what they are in English, right? So it makes sense that she would be using them, but also very subtly both defining them in English and then also exploring how that English doesn't really reflect what's going on in the Haisla word. It was a really lovely and subtle, again, it's a very sort of softly done gesture of going back and forth between the two languages to tease out the implications of the culture and make it sensible to the reader, who may not know that culture, but also to Lisa herself. Like, it made sense in universe, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really beautiful aspect of the novel.
I think the other major thing that we might want to talk about with this novel is how death is represented in it, especially because the last book that we looked at, The Purgatorio, also is about education, but also about how we interact with the dead.
That's true.
Did you find any interesting echoes when you were reading this of The Purgatorio?
I wasn't thinking about the correspondences at all when I was reading Monkey Beach, but after I'd finished reading it, I found myself thinking about it, and that was extremely fascinating. I think that the big difference I feel is in The Purgatorio, like, Dante has sometimes points of connection, and we talked about those with those he sees in Purgatory. But here, it's so affective. It's so emotional. Like, it's sometimes about love, and it's sometimes about, it's terrifying. So when Lisa's at the fire with her mamau and they're feeding the Twinkies into the fire, it's sort of sweet and playful and charming. And she's like reciting the numbers 1 to 10 and Haisla for her grandfather. Like, it's loving and charming, right? But then at these other moments, like when Lisa encounters this graveyard at Kamano when she's off camping with the family. So at Kamano, there's a graveyard. In the time of the great dying, whole families were buried in one plot. Pick wild blueberries when you're hungry. Let the tart taste sink into your tongue, followed by that sharp sweetness that store-bought berries lack. Realize that the plumpest berries are over the graves. It's an odd little passage, right? Because when you're first reading it, pick wild blueberries when you're hungry, let the tart taste sink into your thumb. You're like, oh, it's another one of those salmonberry passages, right? We're going to be like hearing about like the fruits of the natural world. But then realize that the plumpest berries are over the graves. So there's this sense that there's a material world of loss and death, right? The great dying. And that's all you get about it. Like, you don't get a lot of information about the great dying, right? You're just like, oh, okay, there's also that big black hole of trauma over there too. And it's imminent, like it's almost there in the same way that the spirit world is almost there. So a little later on, she describes seeing wolf footprints, and she follows them and went hunting through the bushes for the wolf and came across some decrepit houses. The roofs had fallen in, the doors were leaning drunkenly against their frames or were flat on the ground. Some of the rooms still had old cups and dishes in them, half hidden in dead leaves and moss.
Wow.
Bob is also like, oh, that's awful. So there's this sense that there's this other world in the sense of the spirit world, but there's also the material traces of the people who were there before. And one of the things that struck me when I was reading this, and it was like struck me really, really forcibly, was thinking about this landscape that Lisa is moving through and thinking about land acknowledgements. So land acknowledgements is a thing that has become, I don't want to say institutionalized, but as more people have become aware that land acknowledgements might be an important thing to do, to sort of say something about the people who were here before and who continue to have a relationship to the land that you're on, they've tended to become less meaningful as they become more institutionalized, right? So it's necessary to kind of think about what you're doing and to really like think about, well, what is it for? What are you doing in a land acknowledgement? And I remember one time being at an event, getting ready for an event that was taking place up at the University of Toronto, a circle on Indigenous story and talking about the land acknowledgement. And Lee Miracle, who was working together to organize it, said, whenever you begin something, you talk about whose land you're on, who's there. She said, for us, if we're doing a land acknowledgement, if I'm at someone's home or someone's place, I'll thank them for letting us be there and gather there. We're welcoming in the people who are there right now, and also the spirits who are there. We're welcoming our ancestors. So it dawned on me as I was reading these passages. I'm like, that's in a sense where land acknowledgements are coming from. They're coming from the sense that the people who are gathered on the land you're on are the people who are here right now, but they're also all the people who were here, right? It's all imminently here. And that feels very different. It is very different depending on whether you're Indigenous and you belong to either the land the particular land you're on, like your tribal group is related to the land that you're on at that moment, or to another area of land, right? Turtle Island. But just thinking about, I mean, it made that real for me in a way that had never been before. So I was really struck by that aspect of this book.
That is really interesting. I'm going to have to think about that some more, but that's really compelling. The thought that I had with relationship to Dante's Purgatorio had to do with a passage where Mama'u she has a heart attack and she has a stroke at some point. I don't remember which is the one that precipitates this, but Lisa is hanging around her a lot and doesn't want to leave her side lest something happen. And so at some point, she says this to Mama'u when they're together, "I don't want you to leave." And Mama'u raises an eyebrow. "When it's time to go, you go," she says. And I sat on the floor and put my head on her knees. "Don't." "The place I'm going," she said, "nobody's hungry and nobody's in pain. Sunny all day. People I love everywhere waiting for me." "No," I said. She touched my hair. "Everybody's singing. Everybody's dancing and laughing." And then the kettle whistles and she says, "Go get us tea. Go on, hurry. You want to miss Dynasty?" But which sounds like it's kind of a changing of subject, but it's also kind of the same thing. It's just like opportunity to catch Dynasty with all your friends. I mean, that's not literally how she's imagining the afterlife, but there's that aspect of it. Like that moment that we're going to have where we're together watching Dynasty is the kind of moment that will be going on forever after death. And it's a kind of interaction that we see, that we talked about with her grandfather and her uncle Nick, that when she has the vision of them, they are people who had a lot of friction in real life, but they are together, being social, being having a nice time together, even as they're sort of being scrappy.
Well, yeah. Looking for Christmas trees, right? Yeah.
And that's such an interesting vision of, let's tentatively say, a kind of paradise, which is very different from what we're going to see when we get around to seeing the Paradiso.
Yeah.
But which is a little bit closer, I think, just a little bit closer to what we sometimes see in the Purgatorio, which feels a lot more like the dead hanging out with each other than the other two parts of the Commedia.
Yeah.
But either way, that's something that I kind of wish Dante had access to, that kind of vision of an afterlife.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, that element, that comparison, I think is really compelling. But the spirit world has this familial being in each other's presence, doing things together, very positive aspect. Like it's not sugar coated or anything like that, but it's all the things Mama'u talks about, right? But it's also kind of terrifying. I mean, so like, let me try to explain this better. There's encounters with the spirit world that involve connecting to your people, that involve the kinds of things that Lisa will see in that sort of visionary experience that she has at the very end of the book, and the kinds of things that Mama'u talks about when she says, when you go, it's time to go, you go, and it's going to be great. Don't worry about it. But the world of the dead is something that Lisa gets glimpses of at other moments as well. And it happens in strange ways. Like at one point, it happens when the kids are playing with a Ouija board and it keeps spelling out MEAT over and over again. Or it happens when there's a scene where she's been raped. And after that, she hears voices. "Bring us meat," the first voice whispered, "and we'll hurt him." And it happens over and over again. And then at another point later on, she's trying to find out where her brother is, what's happened to her brother. "We can help you," a voice says, "give us meat." So there's these moments where that spirit world is kind of threatening and dangerous and tricky. Like there's this other moment where Lisa talks about having gone with her schoolmates out to the old burial ground, and the students were told to take rubbings of the stones. And she does this one particular one that says it has like 100 and then a backwards F. And she does the rubbing, and she's with it with her grandmother, and they talk about how if you look at the inverse of it, the backwards, it says fool. She says, "Oh, the dead are always like that. They're always like deceitful and tricky." And it's like, kind of terrifying, right? I mean, that's what I meant by if you wanted to put this book in a genre category, like gothic or horror is one of the things you could do, because there's like these moments that are like, whoa, that's incredibly creepy. But it's not the same as, the gothic genre as we know it, because this is one aspect of the spirit world, which can be nurturing and positive and affirmative and good, but it also is like dark and very dangerous.
I have two thoughts to respond to that. One is a fantastic line early in the book where Lisa's thinking to herself, I used to think that if I could talk to the spirit world, I'd get some answers. Ha, bloody ha. I wish the dead would just come out and say what they mean instead of being so passive aggressive about the whole thing. That was the first moment where I was like, I'm really into this book. I'm on board for whatever's going to go down. And the second one is very near the end of the book, where she's having her visions, and she has a vision of Mama'u. And Mama'u is kind of trying to pull her out of the visions a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And says,
because they're dangerous.
Yeah, and says, you have a dangerous gift. Unless you know how to use it, it will kill you.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of threat when we see other moments of that. I mean, you describe some of them, but there are plenty of moments where interacting with the spirit world is really not necessarily the best idea for a living person to do. They're playing by their own set of rules, which are barely scrutable at best. So this is also a real downer of a book. Like, I liked it, but oh boy, it's hard reading in a lot of places.
It made me very sad. Like, I loved the book, but it made me very sad.
It just made me despondent. It made me just like, people are awful. Humanity's awful. Everything's awful. Why do we even bother pretending like it's not awful? And, which, is not too far off from how I normally feel, but it really just made that in technicolor, so to speak. And I'm just thinking about this book, there's a lot of fantastic, well done things in it. There's a lot that I enjoyed. I mean, I'm glad I spent the time with the book, certainly. But this is not necessarily the kind of novel that I normally read just for pleasure, because it is so much of a downer. And I wanted to think about, books that are about or exploring trauma or terrible things that happen to people that are based on real events, like so much of this book is. Not based on a true story as far as I know, but it's based on real cultural happenings. Like, it's very much centered in the reality of this community. And like, why do we read them? I guess I have a sense of why people might write them, as a kind of catharsis, as a way of bearing witness, as a way of, saying something important, as a way of leaving a kind of monument to what's gone down. But like, why do we read them?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. It's one that we kind of touched on, but didn't really take on when we read Beloved, Toni Morrison's Beloved. And there, I feel like maybe we were preoccupied with thinking about the history, and I don't know, like we were addressing it in a different kind of way. Here, for me, I feel like the book is beautiful, and I learned so much. They're so rich in all the ways we've been talking about. And it made me really sad, but it made me sad in a very cathartic kind of way, I feel like. I also had a grandmother I was extremely close to, and obviously, like, none of these kinds of experiences are compatible, but that sense of love and that sense of just like hanging out with your grandmother, like day after day, just doing stuff around. And like, my grandmother loved watching soap operas, just like, I think I let me feel the love for my grandmother and like, sorrow at her loss. But the other thing is, I had an uncle I was extremely close to who died when I was 12 under very bad circumstances. And so all these passages where she's just hanging out by herself with her uncle, and they're like passages where, because we see abuse in other parts of this book, we know could go wrong, right? So for example, when they're off camping together, the family, Lisa goes off with her uncle and they take a couple buckets to go get water. And Mick kept walking, and I had to run to catch up, my feet sinking in the stones and then slipping. So I had to concentrate on each step or fall. They go to the stream, to a clear, dark pool. He sat down on a log that was green with moss and lichen. As he set his pails down, I sat beside him, the log squishing underneath me, soft with rot. Mick leaned over, hand on his knees. I kicked my feet back and forth, letting them thump against the log and bounce off. The stream was quiet, making whispery sounds. Mick finally stood up and dipped his pails into the pool. I handed him mine, and he filled it halfway. The water was clear, but littered with twigs. "Taste it," Mick said. I shook my head. It's good. As if to prove it, he leaned over the pool and dipped his hand in the water. And they spend more time there, and then they go back with the pails of water. That's a scene that could have gone bad, but it doesn't. And it's like incredibly intimate in a strange kind of way, right? And so these scenes of like intimacy between niece and uncle, like that are loving, but they're fine, right? And then this like terrible sense of loss. I just resonated with me a lot. After my uncle died, I had this dream. Like I was very shocked when he died because it was really sudden. And I had this dream. It must have been, I don't know, maybe, I have no idea how long, a couple of weeks, maybe a month, I don't know. And I was walking down a hill. That was a place where we used to go rock hunting when I was a kid. And just sort of walking down there, and I was by myself, and it was like there's greenery and this and that. And I saw an iris that I wanted to pick, and I leaned over, I was going to pick it. And just in that moment, my uncle Mike came from behind me in the dream and picked it and handed it to me. And when our hands touched, I woke up and my face was wet with tears, and like, it's vivid to me now as it was when I was 12 years old, right? So those passages for me were like so like cathartic, I guess, in a way. Like, I know this is a totally different world, and like, there's limits to how you see yourself in the books you read, but like one of the things this book did for me is we really brought that back. So it's like a really powerful book. And so that's what it does for you. Like, so it's painful and it's sad, but it's also like good in a way. I don't know. I feel like it is.
I mean, I will say it didn't have those kinds of reactions to me. I mean, I had I had a grandmother who I had spent time with in some ways, but it wasn't similar enough to what was going on in the book that I couldn't have that kind of lovely cathartic moment through it. Mm. There was still plenty to appreciate. Like, it's a very well written book and very smart and
it's beautifully structured. It's deceptive because it looks like it's very loosely structured, but it's beautifully structured.
Yeah, it felt really loosely structured at first. Everything felt like it was just leading to a tangent, and it was a little hard to wrap my head around at first. But by the end of it, I was just impressed with the amount in the book and the amount of loosely woven threads that have been pulled together in interesting patterns throughout it. There are all sorts of really interesting resonances and all sorts of very quiet things going on. So that sort of standing back from the book and thinking about that gorgeous web that has been woven is my main pleasure from the book, as well as these really interesting ideas about education and death that we've been talking about. But perhaps because I didn't have that cathartic moment, the emotional difficulty of the book was a lot.
Yeah, I know, I hear you.
We've talked a lot about Monkey Beach. I feel like we've barely touched major aspects of the book.
Yeah, there's so much more to say about it. I would just say read it. It's a really good book.
Yeah, and I mean, we never talk about the whole book, really. We always leave things. I mean, when we did the Aeneid, it was perfectly fine to mostly be focusing on one tiny book of it. But, sometimes when it's a new book and we're both very excited about it, you really want to talk about all of it, and you feel like you're not doing it justice by leaving entire aspects of the novel on the table. It's a good book. It's a rich book. It's well worth reading and knowing about. And the next book that we'll be reading as we continue on our cluster on education is the Disciplina Clericalis by Petrus Alfonsi, which I believe will not be as sad.
No, it's actually really interesting and weird and great. It's a frame tale narrative that's full of all kinds of interesting stories, and it kind of gives you a neat window into I was going to say 12th century Spain, but also in some ways the British Isles. It's written in Latin, but it reflects a whole bunch of different cultural formations. And it's all about learning in a really kind of playful way.
Well, that sounds super intriguing. I haven't read this one before, and I'm excited to read it. So, on that note, we should wrap up. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can always email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. We'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links for things we've talked about in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/35, and the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So, until next time,
see you again at the Spouter-Inn.